Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. It's my pleasure, privilege, etc., to introduce us, our friend, Robin Harper, who's been with us all throughout the DRAD journey from the beginning, sometimes waking up at 4 a.m. in the morning in New York to join our meetings. And then, traveling with us to Tbilisi, to Glasgow. Have you missed anything else? Have you missed Paris, maybe, and Helsinki? Yes, okay. Well, two big misses nonetheless. And she was kind enough to accept our invitation to be our second keynote for our conference. So Robin A. Harper is a professor of political science at York College, a division of the City University of New York, and in the MA program in International Migration Studies at CUNY Graduate Center. The issue that motivates much of her current research agenda is the way government policies and practices create opportunities for inclusion and exclusion for migrants. She is particularly interested in how policies are understood by various constituencies and how those understandings inform and shape their behavior. Her research examines such issues as comparative citizenship policy, comparative immigrant policy, inclusion/exclusion policy and practice, temporary labor migration, social remittances, temporalities, and border politics. Professor Harper, before coming to York College, was a visiting assistant professor at Wellesley College and adjunct assistant professor at Queens College and Brooklyn College. Prior to her academic career, she was the Deputy Director of Immigrant Affairs and Language Services for the New York City Mayor's Office and the Policy Supervisor for Social Services and Immigrant Affairs at the New York City Office of Management and Budget. She served as a policy analyst as a Robert Bosch Fellow in the Office of Integration Affairs for the Berlin, Germany Senate, where her work centered on violence against immigrants. She also worked in the German Federal Ministry of Labor in the Immigrant Integration Department. Early in her career, she worked in development as a project supervisor for French cross-border social service / public health program in Pakistan, Afghanistan. She's currently completing a book on how temporary labor migration schemes always disappoint. Now, I'm sure you're really impressed with this CV, considering the fact that how it goes really way beyond the American stereotype that someone who would only work on American politics, write about the citizenship in America, etc. Professor Harper brings an international experience, multilinguistic skills, and academic work, meeting civil service, and then extremely open extrovert personality who's been always with us throughout the DRAD journey and always available. So I'm so pleased to have her here. I'm sure you also will enjoy the talk that she's going to give now. Thank you very much, Rob.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you all for being really intrepid conference goers like you. I know the only thing that's standing between your beer is my talk. So I'm really grateful for your presence. We are in a real moment of flux when new realities of peoples, places, and identities are being formed. It's too soon to call, but there are days when it feels like a Kuhnian paradigmatic shift, a world in transition. Of course, this really isn't news to any of us. We're always in some form of transition: mass immigration, rewriting national narratives, economic dislocation, previous waves of migration that reset the human geography across Europe, Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And there's no irony that's lost on me that today's descendants of the Huns, the Vandals, and the other panoply of barbarians, names that are now synonymous with pernicious behavior, as well as crusaders and explorer-conquerors whose arrival reshaped Europe and the world, who brought new ideas and new ways of thinking, are now decrying the mass arrivals of newcomers whose presence brings new ideas and new ways of thinking. Each time the arrivals bring disruption, disorientation, and because I really can't resist the opportunity for a third alliteration, destruction, only to birth a new reality, and hopefully with hope and opportunity. We are at a crossroads where we are deciding the direction. Where we are and where we want to be is not the same. We are seeing people come to our countries seeking refuge, but not necessarily looking for the cultures that they find. We have people whose families have been present for generations and reject the current reality, seeking to travel in time to some place they think existed in the past. Whether it did or it didn't is not really material. There are people who live among us who want to become part of the larger collective, but are rebuffed and rejected at every turn and told that they're not part of the community, even though they pass every single test that we impose on them. And we have a whole lot of people who just want to live quietly and are perennially pushed into social upheaval. Ironically, regardless of which camp anybody fits into, all of us are decrying this moment as a time of intense alienation. The lack of coherent national stories is disorienting, and this is true for the classic immigration states that have aged into multi-generational native populations with new immigrants, and the formerly ethnic states that are now new countries of immigration. All are struggling with figuring out who they are, who they long to be, and coming to terms with what they did historically in the name of nation building and people making, as well as their present-day insufficiencies. I will layer on top of this a Europe that's also trying to figure out who it is and where the borders are in a borderless fortress Europe. In this real-time protracted process, states are flailing, unable to create a master narrative that finds a place of honor for all, but candidly admits the wrongdoings and seeks atonement. As I really have said privately before, "We suck" is not a national rallying cry. You cannot build a nation like that. We need to rather rededicate ourselves to reinvent stories of peoplehood so there's a place for all to belong. Keynote and Hjort write in their book, The Post-National Self-Belonging and Identity, that the English word belonging is a fortuitous compound of being and longing. And I have to tell you, from the minute I read that, I fell in love with this idea. The word conjures up these ideas of being pulled in two directions. In the first, the being. The individual is placed firmly situated in the present, a place that is solid. In the second, there's a longing, a wistful, romantic yearning for something beyond the present condition, where there's craving and lamenting what isn't. We are in this specific space between the two. Belonging is the feeling of security and support with a sense of acceptance, inclusion, and identity as a member of a certain group. A sense of belonging, however, is based on an individual's perception of their connection to others and to space. To belong is to be accepted by others. It's a reflection of being accepted. You can feel attached to other people. You can connect to other people, but belonging requires that you appreciate that the other recognizes you and feels connected to you. It is an affective experience, not a cognitive one. You may want so much to feel attached, but that doesn't mean that you belong. Others determine that you belong, but in the end, only you can decide to accept that belonging. I'm supposed to, where does this go to turn to the next slide? This is embarrassing. Oh. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. I have a few different portions of this, and we'll talk about a need for enemies, things that impede capacity for belonging, identity, and community. We're going to talk about swimming and in the pool, and then some models of transformation and transition. What are we reintegrating people into, and what do we do next? And I have some proposals that I hope might be useful. Humans are social creatures that crave interaction with others. And in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he says, just after securing the very basics to stay alive, right in the middle, to support yourself, we seek belonging. But in finding a place for ourselves in belonging, we have created a border to who we are and who we are not. So already we're setting up opposition. Belonging is a political and a cultural ordering principle to demarcate insiders and outsiders. And that's what he says about it. That you will then long for, that once you've tasted belonging, you will hurt when it is no longer there. So I want to tell you, the first time I came to Berlin, It was just after the Berlin Wall fell. I'm going to age myself here. And I was like, excuse me, everybody at this time coming to New York, coming from New York to Berlin to chip the wall with rented 5 Deutschmark hammers. We were all spellbound by the promise of democracy and the possibility of what could be. And I was wondering, what's going to happen in this place? Following the work of renowned political psychologist Vamik Volkan, I wondered about the need for enemies and allies in moments of strife and transition. There we go. It's misspelled. Oh my goodness, that's terrible. It's, okay. His last name is misspelled. I apologize. So he writes about this inescapable developmental phenomenon, man's need to identify that some people are allies and others are enemies. It stems from an individual's effort to protect his sense of self, which is intertwined with his experiences of ethnicity, nationality, and other identifying circumstances. When threatened by political or military conflict, man clings ever more stubbornly to these circumstances in an effort to maintain and regulate his sense of self. So off I went in the summer of 1990 with a huge backpack and my recorders and notebooks to interview student leaders who had been involved with the various revolutionary movements and do a study on the creation of enemies in the now budding post-communist countries of Europe. In this incredible historic inflection point, I wondered if you could already perceive the creation of new enemies now that the Soviet Union was no longer there, lording over these countries. Who would the enemies be? Who would belong? Who would be ostracized? And I admit I was very young and inexperienced when I did this, but the conversations elicited some interesting thoughts on belonging, exclusion, and the genesis of populism. And since it's like 1 million years ago, I want to take us back in time just to see what they had to say. So long before there were cogent plans to join the EU, they thought about rebuilding the nation state without the Soviet pressure. And one idea that really resonated with these students was that they needed to consolidate the ethnic nation before contending with minorities. We started to see nationalism already. She says, we need to work first with our own people to build Poland before we think of other people. They don't concern us now. Only Poland and Poles are important now. It was really an idea that they didn't have time yet for minorities because they didn't know who they were. I also saw a lot of people expressing concern that their countries might not weather the transitions and the incompatibility of the different peoples within the state. Some called even for the dissolution of their states. In anticipating the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, we heard that we're not like them, and so we have a big problem. And a lot of uneasy feelings as well between a Western Czech Republic and a more Eastern Slovak Republic, and the difficulties of living as a minority between the two, finding themselves completely lost in this transition. And then something which I have to say, given the current situation in Ukraine, one of the people explained that the regime which is leaving us is not leaving us with what they have promised, friendship of nations, only hatred and problems between nations. We don't even know each other, so we fight and we hate. The interviewees were not convinced that there was any new enmity, but new opportunities for enmity to be expressed. And this one says that there's a lot of anti-Semitic feeling, especially among young people. We have a very low economic level, and we have to take out our stress in the best way possible, and the best way is to hate something. To imagine that there is something worse than we are, we must hate somebody to say that he is worse than we are, to have some good feeling, and that we are a little better than the others. The point actually that was brought up yesterday in the discussion. On the one side, they heralded this great democratic reality and free expression and the free market. I have to tell you, every single one of them was convinced there were no losers in democracy or in capitalism, and that all of them were going to be the winners, except some of them then said that they were very concerned and that they felt very threatened by change. And the questions about dignity and what would happen. And in this one, this is a former East German still existed. And he says that the West Germans come in with their fancy cars and fancy clothes and make fun of everything we do, from our Saxon accent to factory production. They treat us like children. They don't let us be men in our own country. If you can't be a man in your own country, you can't be a man anywhere. And they worried how they would handle their newly found freedom and if they would make good choices because of having little experience with democracy. Without the critical eye of the censor and fear of security apparatuses, people would now freely air offensive ideas that they had once kept to themselves. This one says, we don't know how to live together, so there are problems. Never did we make a country together. We have no history of living together without fighting. Change came slowly and then very quickly, and they feared that the future, that they were not ready to be the rulers in democracy. It says we live like slaves. No one can come to slaves and say, here is your freedom, here it is, and then we are free. It's not like that. We must earn our freedom, and then we can teach ourselves and maybe others. However, regular politics requires regular action. Revolutionary activity is super sexy, but people are not very interested in the bread and butter politics that you need for democracy. So we also saw these classic collective action problem laments that normal people drop out when politics is everyday action. And he tells us they want to rest, they're tired. This is our real problem. Migration means movement, and movement means dislocation and disruption. Migration is a trauma-induced activity at all ends of the income scale. I think it's really important that we recognize this. Nobody corners the market on pain. It is traumatic to leave your country, language, culture, dominant position and come to a new place where the background is not accepted, your educational degree may not be recognized, and your way of thinking doesn't match the general public. When the receiving state politically infantilizes you on arrival, at lower levels and certainly among those coming as asylum seekers, as refugees and irregular migrants, experiencing treacherous migration journeys, this dislocation is certainly magnified multifold. Once they arrive, they find themselves stuck. The struggle to learn the language and culture, contend with social isolation and loneliness, being caught in what students of temporalities call the wasting of waiting, at the intersection of politically imposed structural conditions and the messiness or complexity of individual ordinary lives. Migration is stressful and it is traumatic. And for natives, it's also traumatic. With the arrival of new people coming with new ways of dressing and eating and communicating can seem very traumatic to people who are unwilling or ready for change. And they create a border. As anthropologist Mary Douglas reminds us about these kinds of liminal spaces, all borders are dangerous. The fear of the unknown and of losing status, whether rational or not, is frightening. And maybe especially true for those at the bottom of the socioeconomic structure who interact and compete with migrants in daily life more than their well-heeled cousins. This is a moment of tremendous movement. This is probably the point of the talk where somebody would start talking about lots of information on growing income inequality and the ability of the welfare state to deliver on promises, but I leave that for other people. I'm going to say there's a lot of loneliness. You'd think with the arrival of more people, we would have less loneliness, but we don't. Loneliness happens when there's a mismatch between the quality and the quantity of the social relationships that we have and those that we want. There are more people than ever living alone in advanced industrial states, but that's a question of isolation, not loneliness. Isolation is a lack of social contact. Loneliness is a subjective feeling. It is a yearning for the other that can only be cured by belonging. In 2002, with the pandemic easing into the background, 9 to 20% of people across Europe reported feeling lonely. This is really scary, but almost 60% of Americans reported the same thing. Loneliness and its big brother, lack of belonging, are unhealthy. They increase risk for mental health, antisocial behavior, physical illness, and even early mortality. The converse is also true. Having a healthy sense of belonging is good for your health, mental health, academic achievement, occupational success. So what can be done to promote belonging? It's a really scary map, right? Like, yeah, I thought so too. Allen et al. In their Australian Journal of Psychology special issue on belonging develop an integrative framework of interrelated dynamic components to foster belonging. Each one of them shows a shift and evolve, adapting as an individual traverses temporal, social, and environmental contexts. And these components for belonging include competencies, opportunities, perceptions, and motivations. So competencies are the skills that you need to align your social norms and cultural values and abilities of self-awareness and communication. If you can't communicate, or you don't have a cultural background that permits interaction, or you are traumatized, you can't build healthy relationships that generate belonging. Opportunities, you have to be able to meet. If you don't, obviously, you can't develop relationships. And this includes these very high, good morning kind of relationships that you have with neighbors, even people you really don't know. It makes people feel like they're seen and included in what psychiatrist Harper, no relation, calls familiar strangers. Putnam's work on social capital identified social networks as fundamental principles for creating opportunity, or these opportunities. Putnam described the concepts of bridging and bonding social capital. Bridging, connecting different peoples together, broadening social networks, while bonding deepens relationships between community members who share some characteristics. Both are important for creating belongingness. The programs that you've all been reporting on to increase inclusive belonging, sports, arts, theater, civic engagement, all have the propensity to create bridges and bonding, prevent social isolation and loneliness. Motivations, very simply put, people have to be motivated to reach out and hold on tight in bonding in order to have healthy relationships. Perceptions. This refers to somebody's subjective thought on feelings about their experiences. You can have all the skills and opportunities, be motivated, and still feel disconnected. Belonging requires a little bit of magic, that you trust and that you believe that you belong. People with histories of rejection, marginalization, stigmatization might shun mainstream groups and seek marginal groups or radical groups. Something came up in the talk yesterday in the morning, trying to find a place within a world that has systematically erased their value. By connecting with others who also have the perception of being ostracized or marginalized, people find the fellowship they crave, the validation for their hatred, and justification for the perception of their lack of acceptance, and rationalization for the lack of competencies, opportunities, and motivations. So where then do we belong? The nation state and even our local communities somehow are not up to the job. We are not just bowling alone, we're bowling lonely. We are alone on our phones, generating digital connections with people with whom we have even weaker ties to than these high people. Irina Neslin writes in The Impact of Identity, The Power of Knowing Who You Are, that communities are not spaces where we have relationships to others around us. Rather, we have become immigrants without ever leaving our homes, disassociating the territorial spaces we used to call home and community. And she observes that our community life is both ubiquitous and thinner than ever. Once upon a time, we longed to communities where there were people around you who shared some sort of geographic or family ties or nationalities. In the Andersonian sense, however, with digitization and social media coupling with thinning connections between people in real life, growing distrust and standing apprehension towards government and civil service, our once territorially based community has been displaced. Neslin reminds us, today, if you own a puppy, you have an instant community of 12,000 people from around the world, but you have nobody to talk to. People are seeking connectedness. Radicalization is an effort to find belonging after alienation and stigmatization. Terrorism expert J. Boyer Bell employed people not to think about radicalism and terrorism as a pathology or incomprehensible to normal people. Why do people do this stuff? Rather, he stated that radical violence required a mindset similar to the all-encompassing feeling of falling in love. The inner passion that drives us to do things that we never thought possible, to ignore truths, and to be consumed by the need for the embrace of this love community, whether the singular beloved or within a radical group. As we've all discussed here many times, it's not the ideology or religion that drives radical violence. Sarah Lyons Padilla points out that many violent extremists have suffered significant loss and thus are on a quest for significance, a sense that their lives have purpose and meaning. Religion is nothing more than a rationalization for their actions. Martha Crenshaw once wrote in her Theories of Terrorism, Instrumental and Organizational Approaches, she goes one step further and advocates that there's an organizational issue at the core here. People join and remain in violent radical groups because they develop a fellowship among the membership. In order to be a terrorist group, in order to be in a terrorist group, you have to perform terrorism. That was supposed to be. I think I'm off. Okay. In Harper's classic, The True Believer, he offers that a mass movement appeals not to those intent on bolstering and advancing a cherished self, but to those who crave to be rid of an unwanted self. Mass movement holds a following not because it can satisfy the desire for self-advancement, but because it can satisfy the passion for self-renunciation. This perception of injustice, grievance, alienation, polarization, and radicalization is a mechanism to be released from the aggrieved status. This is true for anyone who feels wronged, regardless of the kind of extremism. Alford writes in The Psychology of Hate that hatred is a relationship with others, and it is a relationship with oneself, in which there is another way of saying that structuring relations with others, people are at the same time structuring their psyches themselves. The hate that is expressed in violent extremism may be unleashed on a victim, but the subject is the perpetrator himself. He is trying to get rid of the denigrated identity imposed on him by the society and shape a new narrative and new identity. Religion and ideology are a narrative framework. People need a story to tell about themselves that replaces the story that's told about them. They want to be the hero in their own narrative, and in so doing, they will no longer be accepted where they once were only rejected. So I'm not going to sing. I could. I'm a good singer. Before the pandemic, a story of an upstart group of rebels in the then American colonies rising up against the British colonial rule a few centuries ago caught the attention of millions in song. In Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical retelling of Ron Chernow's The Story of Alexander Hamilton, a young, impoverished immigrant with a keen sense of history and a brilliant economic and political mind, the musical Hamilton poses the question, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? This theme could clearly be the leitmotif of all of the movements and its adherents that we've been talking about. What story is told about you? Who shapes the narrative, and who do they tell? What do they tell? Are they seeking asylum in search of freedom or economic enrichment? Do they perform dirty, dangerous, and dull jobs that no one wants, or are they stealing jobs and displacing citizens? Are they moral and good people following the traditions of good immigrants who will eventually become good naturalized citizens, or are they violent, marauding sexual predators who endanger our society? And natives are in the same. Did they build the country that exists now, or did they simply exploit others, labor, and suppress them? Did they make great inventions that enriched the world, or did they steal others' ideas? Were they the defenders of values of the Enlightenment, or colonial and violent overlords extracting ill-gotten wealth and brutalizing and victimizing others wherever they went? Who tells the story and the role you and your group play in it? The story that is told and accepted becomes the source of how you are treated. Schneider and Ingram theorized in The Social Construction of Target Populations, Implications for Politics and Policy. How we categorize people determines their deservingness, and then how we provide for them in policy and practice. This is where the real power lives. So, okay, meeting people. I know you said, what could possibly be the connection with swimming pools? Meeting people in social, not meaning political, spaces is critical for the loose ties and the spontaneous conversations that lay the groundwork for friendships and allyships for subsequent political action that undergird democratic societies. As a locus for sites of encounter, public spaces expose people to all different kinds of people who live there, different ethnic groups, racial groups, social and economic groups, and this should be good. Starting social science, starting with Gordon Alpert in the 50s, develops this contact hypothesis that says merely by assembling people without regard for race, color, religion, or national origin, we can thereby destroy stereotypes and develop friendly attitudes. The underlying assumption is if we only knew each other, even in the most trivial encounters, mutual feelings of anxiety and uncertainty would decrease, and likewise, we would trust and empathy would develop. Here's where I'm going to start singing, leading to the transformation of the social relations between peoples. And this is, whether Jane Jacobs' sidewalk conversations or Lynn Laughlin's chance opportunities to give people guidance, all of these kinds of things, if you know people, you'll like them. And I love these thoughts. They make us feel like we belong just by showing up. But the thing that really upsets me is research shows that maybe these public space encounters actually do the opposite and make us more aware of differences between minority natives, immigrants, and migrants of all kinds. This awareness and accentuation of difference can provoke more enmity and populist social behavior. Riaz and Romer published a rather surprising piece whose title is now called Racial Threat in Public Social Spaces, but the original title was Does Interethnic Contact Reduce Prejudice? Evidence from Public Swimming Pools. And they did their work in Germany, where a quarter of the population here, as you know, is from what's called a migration background, and there are absolutely gorgeous swimming pools. If you have not been to the public swimming pools in Germany, you should. And they're in neighborhoods all over the place. And they expose people to ethnic diversity in these public, social spaces. And what they find is that repeated intergroup encounters in public social spaces actually elevate Native voters' awareness of immigration, multiculturalism, demographic change, and thus increase the salience of immigration, galvanizing a racial threat perception among Native voters, increasing voting to the benefit of the far-right parties. In this case, the Alternative für Deutschland. I found this report shocking, and I kept rewatching it on German TV to say that this can't be so. But then I remembered Heather McGee's work on The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, where she recounts the fact that rather than swim together in pools in the United States, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 that ordered that people be able to be in public facilities without regard to race, large communities of largely white conservative voters filled the swimming pools with cement, denying themselves and their families access to the pools in the blazing summer sun rather than swim with their African-American neighbors. McGee asserts that people perceive their neighbors who are different getting anything as a zero-sum experience and would prefer to deny everyone everything rather than share something with their neighbors. Of course, we have to question if this is true in other places and whether other kinds of spaces facilitate positive encounters. Are we just too intimate at the swimming pool so it exaggerates the cultural cleavage between us? Okay, so we're moving down. If radicalization is an individual process that culminates in extremism, then de-radicalization is an individual process that culminates in, must it be individual? Must it be a process? Is it an outcome? What is the opposite of extremism? In 1986, Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel wrote that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. But he never told us what the opposite of hate was. Then what is the opposite of extremism, and when would we know if we had arrived there? Do different people have different places on the spectrum of radicalism and de-radicalism? Is a little radical better than regular radical, or is it kind of like a little bit pregnant? Is disengagement sufficient, or does it lead to latent political radicalization that just pushes the national spectrum towards populism? Horgan concluded after interviewing former terrorists that, quote, all of the interviewees could be described as disengaged. The vast majority of them could not be said to be de-radicalized. Disengagement is a more realistic goal than de-radicalization, but is it sufficient? It's really hard to say because, as Horgan and Braddock note, we don't have any really reliable indicators. What works in one region may not work in another, as the specific social contexts that precipitate radicalization differ, even as the more general sources of marginalization, significance loss, cultural homelessness, marginalization, alienation, and discrimination are the same. What is clear is that effective de-radicalization requires wanting to change. Longing does not mean it will happen, but without the longing, there will be no change. As all of us know from our own personal relationships, you can't change somebody if they don't want to change themselves. And this change is risky. De-radicalization means leaving one community where you belonged to incorporate into a community where you have been marginalized, othered, stigmatized, or rejected, rather than embraced for the courage to change previously held attachments and beliefs. It is hardly enticing. Dement et al. Suggests 5 reasons why it's so hard to disengage, even for those who want to. Leaving means losing. Closely knit communities, an exclusive claim to a national or religious identity, relationships beyond the radical milieu and their support and protection, the ideal of the right way of life, and the structure and entering really into an abyss. Leaving the radical milieu does not mean that people will abandon their radical ideas, but radical views are not necessarily dangerous. De Silva et al. Remark that even though, quote, individuals develop a radicalized view after joining a violent organization, not before, it is important to note that while radicalized views may open a path to politically motivated violence, they are not criminal or harmful in themselves. So how do we bring people who have transgressed or transgressing into the mainstream norms and rid the badness, normalize them, naturalize them, you'll excuse the pun, if you will. And I came up with 3 models for reintegration. First one is one of post-incarceration reintegration, achieving social life after civil death. Alcoholics Anonymous, achieving sobriety to master the self in order to regain society. And Immigrant Incorporation, ridding the foreignness to join the community of citizens. In each case, individuals are taught that they must change in order to become part of society. This may mean accepting that their old ways are no longer acceptable, developing new habits, processes, or behaviors ostensibly for their own good, and as a result, to protect people and society from harm. Each person must effectively master his former offensive behaviors and transform himself. He must undergo a ritual to create and mark personal transformation and perception of self, yielding societal recategorization and perception of change. Van Gennep first described rites of passage rituals as a series of progressive steps: separation, transition, liminality, reincorporation with a new status. Rituals move people from their normal state of being, providing purification, dramatize change through suspension, through old and new statuses, and then reincorporate people with a new identity and a new status within the community. The ritual serves both the individual who moves between statuses as it is for the society who receives. So in the first one, post-incarceration reintegration, and I have to say, coming from a country that incarcerates 25% of the world's prison population, it's a little cheeky for me to be talking about anything that we learn from post-incarceration. But there you go, like most Americans, it never stopped me from opining. So I'm going to talk here largely from a US perspective, but there are lessons to be drawn out for situations with vastly different histories and national experiences. So let me just explain this one part. Reintegration after incarceration assumes that there's something to return to, something into which you would reintegrate. However, given broken families and communities, extreme poverty, and structural and everyday racism, return is not necessarily to a better place. The capacity to carve out a meaningful place after imprisonment is fraught. Calvin John Smiley, in his recent book, Purgatory Citizenship, reminds us the legal status and the social experience post-incarceration is altered. He says, individuals are neither fully integrated nor expelled within the American populace, but rather further pushed to the margins without the ability to have a voice or agency, limiting access to power in society and creating a cyclical, perpetual punishment. The price of reentry is the marginalization that often replicates the carceral structures that they just left. The liminal in-between is constructed in such a way to unmake prison behaviors and impose normalizing, ostensibly mainstream behaviors. Transitioning out of prison doesn't necessarily make someone free. Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow observes that the various legal ways felony conviction creates a second-class citizenship that is now rooted in law and prohibition of opportunities, rather than de facto experience of structural racism and classism that they experienced pre-prison. Post-prison transition is not obvious. Leaving prison often results in culture shock as the outside world, outside the prison gates, has experienced progress in ways that the life inside has not. The formerly incarcerated enter a society they do not know, with few of the technological skills and cultural cues formed during their absence, and face barriers to enter a job market that they may or may not have ever participated in, and a society that is many ways alien. Of course, different countries impose different ways of punishing and transitioning, but halfway houses, quarter houses, the names alone reflect a belief that there's kind of a straight trajectory from the civil death of prison to full incorporation after release. Probation and parole and the rules associated with those experiences mean that individuals may not live with anyone that's been involved in the criminal justice system or be near people who use alcohol and recreational drugs. That may be all the people that they know. They must report their comings and goings and be ready for drug and alcohol tests on demand, even in the middle of the night. As Smiley suggests, reentry is not an outcome but a process in which formerly incarcerated navigate and negotiate their identities with freedom, increasing social stigma and decreased legal rights. It's not linear or uniform, but precarious, and people's lives are messy, and the process subjects the previously incarcerated to a host of public and private actors whose rules and practices generate barriers, distrust, and anxiety toward the society they're supposed to be theoretically being welcomed back into. In the end, you have to ask whether the reintegration process works. After recidivism, and it's hard to say because the determinants of success are measured differently from country to country. So I only was able to get like a more or less uniform from these random countries that were on the list about recidivism, and you can see the range is high, and with the exception of Norway and Singapore, pretty much everybody's results are pretty scary.
What's the 3 years?
Oh, everybody else was a 2-year period. The Germans only produced 3-year, but I decided to put them in because we were here. Yeah. Okay, I'll leave that. So it's hard to compare national experiences to see where reintegration works because the definition of recidivism often differs from nation to nation. And I should tell you that these are pretty cheery because if you look at the figures for 5 or 10 years, most of them are in the 60 to 80% range. Success, which it will be here, you should remember that participation in any of these reintegration programs, post-incarceration programs, is not voluntary. You are forced to do it, and success here is defined as a return to the social norm, even if it's not for your community, and is marked by complete repudiation of past behavior and no mercy for those who fail. Okay, we'll go from jail to Alcoholics Anonymous. The experience with Alcoholics Anonymous is also kind of complex to ascertain. 12-step programs that are found in 180 nations around the world, and the idea is to admit that you are powerless in handling alcohol, so you submit to a higher power, make an inventory of your failings, and make amends with those you have harmed, asking for forgiveness, and share your experience to move it forward. I'm not making light of this. This is really, it's very intense for the people who are able to achieve it. Perhaps all of you are very familiar with the basic structure, but meetings are held frequently. People wanting to achieve sobriety attend meetings anonymously and then listen or share their story of weakness or triumph over a desire for alcohol. The group always offers affirmation. Success is marked by time, and people find another alcoholic in recovery as a sponsor to help reinforce sobriety by speaking candidly and gaining emotional support. The fundamental assumption is that all alcoholics are drinking or in recovery. There is no cure. Reintegration is complicated by the fact that former friends and relatives or situations may endanger sobriety, and therefore return is not possible. So these are there. It's mighty crunched up, but these are the 12 steps that I just explained. From the Alcoholics Anonymous perspective, alcoholics cannot drink socially. Anything less than complete sobriety is a deviation from the program. And AA has been criticized for being a cult, relying on religion and preying on the vulnerable. Studies on AA have mixed results, largely because there is a lack of experimental evidence on the effectiveness of such programs, and also because it's hard to disentangle whether sobriety is because of the 12-step program or because of the repetitive social learning that Bandura tells about that transpires from attending meetings, storytelling, role modeling, fellowship with others, seeking sobriety and separation from those on a different path, displacing craved drinking time with meetings, talk therapy, and affirmation during the meetings. Addiction psychiatrist Adam Sack explains that addicts often feel subhuman, and this helps them restore their sense of self-worth and become part of the human family through this process. AA's own statistics on effectiveness reveals that complete abstinence is really hard to achieve. They're attacked for overestimating their success, but even at 20 years, at 20% after 1 to 6 years, I think is hardly a rave. There may be starts and stops, and please remember, every time you have a drink, you start from the beginning. The recovering alcoholic is permanently on the edge of failure and equally on the edge of being embraced. Belonging through acceptance is available at any time, no matter how great the failure. Okay. Our third case, from immigrant to citizen. The stories of how people move from foreigner to member is different from country to country, with different histories and cultures and imaginations of the possible. However, what is the same is that there are expectations that people will live in a country for a certain amount of time and with a determined legal status. The state will not run after you, looking for you to naturalize. The decision to naturalize is completely dependent on immigrant demand. Immigrants will be expected to be truthful in all of their affairs and to have mostly mainstream politics and clean criminal records. The state will expect that immigrants will adopt local cultures and norms to an acceptable extent, thus ridding themselves of the intolerable difference. They will learn sufficient language and culture to be deemed ready for citizenship, and this is really very much in accordance with the local expectations. And here there's a whole lot of deviation. The US expectation, for instance, for language acquisition is really, really basic. You're required to write 1 sentence in English, and a sentence that, that I know someone who had: the president lives in the White House. And if that, you've met the level, whereas in Europe, the level at a B1 in intermediate language ability is substantially higher and harder to achieve. You're expected to pay money, which is actually requiring people to have a certain income standard. Most European and classic immigration countries require an oath of allegiance, which can simply be affirming supporting the Constitution and the law, or perhaps renouncing their former citizenship, or give a litany of expectations like the US does, which demands that people promise to serve in the military or perform civil service if ordered. There may or may not be a ceremony of naturalization, and there will be artifacts of certification provided by the state attesting that the immigrant has passed sufficient tests to be considered no longer a foreigner and naturalized to the acceptable standards of that state, effectively for legal purposes, like all other citizens. Success here is defined as achieving naturalization, which may or may not be the state's definition of success with immigrants. So long as you completely submit to the state, you can be included in the polity and the community of consent. So in comparing these, 3 different things, I realized that there was implied acceptance to show how you were before is not tolerable and must be changed. There's hope for a new life, but only if there's a complete submission to the process. For AA and the naturalization regime, entry is voluntary, and it's always possible to try again without penalty. For all others, there are structured activities and some community support at the beginning, but only AA offers an ongoing support network because you're never there. You're always in the process of. Like these 3 cases, a comparative review of disengagement of de-radicalization programs reveals some of these same success markers. Of the 30 disengagement and de-radicalization programs assessed by Pop, Canna, and Day in common characteristics of successful programs, de-radicalization programs of the past, only half were deemed generally successful. And even these half, what made them successful? They created a sense of hope and purpose. They created a sense of community. They provided individual attention and regimented day-to-day schedules, keeping people busy. And they provided sustainable long-term commitment following the completion of the program, aftercare. So long after it ended, they did things with people to make sure they were employed and active. Okay, so what do we do next? So here's my happy proposals. We are getting down to the end of the line. Even if we are focused exclusively on de-radicalization in the global north, to be effective, we need to think beyond what we in the global north think would be good. How do we appeal to people whom the current Western secular vision, and here I'm talking about religious and right-wing radical extremism, is simply insufficient? What can we offer in the place of the warmth, the structure, the promise of the future, the ridding of the hatred image of the self, and the feeling of being in love, of belonging? In a fascinating study by Kurtenbach et al., examining de-radicalization programs in Germany and Pakistan. The goals for de-radicalization were fundamentally different. In Germany, the radicalization is seen as a process by which the client moves away from democratic views and values and norms of the majority society. The primary goal for de-radicalization stopped at disengagement from violence. Cognitive de-radicalization, distancing from extremist ideology, was conceivable, but deemed far too difficult to achieve. In contrast, the goal in Pakistan was to replace a radical orientation of religion by instilling new religious narratives and providing the social support that normally comes from religious groups, by offering treatment for depression, anxiety, frustration, loneliness. And the official that they spoke with said, "We have to clean their minds from the wrong interpretation of religion." The radical group that offered the warm embrace, activities with others and associates who share a worldview and structure. Removing connections creates a vacuum. You cannot replace something with nothing. The Pakistanis were trying to replace bad religion with good religion. What we are doing is insufficient for everyone. What can secular states replace religion with? Citizenship. Since I'm a citizenship scholar, that's why I'd say that. It is probably the only place where we can meet. Where do we go from here? Well, I have these 3 proposals, and then I'm done. So for academics, and I'm really speaking to this group because I think the stuff that you have produced as part of this Horizon project is phenomenal. It has so many different facets and aspects to it, from all of the, classic academic articles and work projects, the theater and the spatial analysis, the art projects, the legal studies, all of it. And it's all on the website, and how great. But I wondered, and I texted Umar and I said, do you guys ever meet with the other Horizon winners and find out what they're doing? And I was surprised that there are a few opportunities. Amelia told me about this last night, but there are no regular meetings between the different groups, either the 3 winners for each of these projects or between other projects, say like projects where there could be some tangential kind of connection between them. And so it seems...
Roman and I, we met some other Horizon project on radicalization. We felt like committing suicide. The essentialization. And then let's see how these Muslims are going to behave in our Zoom and watch them. And then let's see how much they're going to apologize for all the radical acts that they committed. That's like phenomenal to watch.
So there's a lot to learn from that.
Well, that's what we learned.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's it. There's a lot to learn. Maybe there's good practice.
This is for radicalization, though. I mean, for migration, for other kinds of processes, it would be a different story.
I offered anything. Been.
Well, so I guess I'm interested in these kinds of things that bring together the projects on, communicating with the different winner kind of projects horizontally, and meeting also with other groups that have very siloed projects, maybe a project on aging or education or whatever the other things that there are, to meet and to share best practices, worst practices, super nightmares in the field, really to learn about things, as well as producing some kind of teaching kits, like the civil education packets, the play kits that would be available for different kinds of audiences. I also really think it's kind of sad that you do all this stuff and then you don't find out 10 years later if anything worked. There should be something put into the budget that says you get to come back and see what happened.
People want to see each other in 10 years' time.
Or not. Okay, for the governments, we should be developing responsible government practices. If we want people to move from radicalized to disengaged or de-radicalized, we need to create the kind of communities where they want to be. This means listening and responding. Muzzy Rosenblatt, who's the CEO of the Bowery Residence Committee, a $200 million organization attempting to bring housing to the homeless in New York City, implores the government to stop telling people what they need to do. Instead, helpers need to start asking people what they need. Further, we need to reinvigorate the concept of citizenship. This current skim milk kind of citizenship is not even on its best day an alternative for the brotherhood and sisterhood that people are finding. Citizenship is now largely transactional, and that has to change. We need to stop doing this. We're going to go vote, and it's done. We need to engage. And here, we're not de-radicalizing them, but radicalizing citizenship, so it's meaningful for all. There is something to exchange for belonging and a payoff then from radicalized groups. US President Abraham Lincoln, in 1838, so almost 190 years ago, thoughts were long before he was assassinated for insisting on the preservation of the United States as one country and not divided, that the people who had fought in the Revolution and imagined a post-colonial future after British control were long dead. And the only thing that held the current people together to these revolutionary ideas and the promise of the state was our Constitution. He implored people to hold fast of it and make a political religion where mothers would sing to their children and lovers would talk about it among themselves. And in this way, I believe that we need this kind of reinvigoration of the concept of citizenship, national, European Union. Citizenship is the one place that no matter our ethnicities, our incomes, our religions, or ages, we can meet on common ground. So we need all kinds of public programming to educate people about how their system works and provide them with the space and the tools to develop their own ideas and demands for what should be. I'm not saying they don't exist, these kind of mechanisms. I'm saying we need a whole lot more because what we're doing is insufficient. And this means we need to reframe our understanding that everybody is at risk of radicalization and disaffection. So changing what we do is going to be to promote engagement and interaction. And I hope I'm not sounding terribly Pollyanna-ish and naive, but a lot of these things are cheap and doable and not politically divisive. And I have to tell you, from working in both the New York City and the Berlin government, those are the things that governments are willing to do. So it includes strengthening social infrastructure, enacting pro-connection public policies, mobilizing the healthcare and social work sectors to deal with all of the health-related things that deal with loneliness and lack of belonging, critically evaluate our relationship with technology, and rethink really what we're going to do and do something, and develop public programs for all. And then for the activists and community leaders, be inclusive. The time is now to ask, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? If the end goal is one where people can live together with dignity, then cheap shots and denigration will not get there. We need to be honest in our research, but we must be just and inclusive in the message, and that means telling the whole truth, painful, cumbersome, and distracting from the easy narratives, whatever they may be. Erasure does not yield inclusion. Finally, reach out and try to find some common ground and make new allyships. To close on a positive note, if I can, I want to return to my research in Eastern Europe and the voice of Sofia, who was then a 23-year-old Romanian engineering student, who, like many of the interviewees, suggested that there was hope for the future of learning how to be free without fear or violence. And she says, we must learn that we cannot be afraid of the truth. In Romania, we are so afraid to tell the truth because in the past it meant that the Securitate would come. We are afraid to trust. Maybe now we can begin. In time, we will learn that the truth is good and we can trust ourselves and the others. Maybe it will happen like that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm so sad.
So
Yes.
Thank you so much. Well, it was really interesting and I really enjoyed with the data from back then to the fraction. But I have a question or maybe two, like a bit conceptual. I added some a bit of citizen stuff during my entry in European study. So then we were very we were already into this idea of EU citizenship for migrants and then maybe upgraded national citizenship. And now, since you're a citizenship scholar, I'm really interested in, is there any debate on this kind of model, and do you see any perspective? And a quick addition, also as a German citizen myself, of course, I grew up with this notion, boomer notion to me of Verfassungspatriotismus, so constitutional patriotism. Is this still a concept that is really used in science, or is it just a Habermasian idealistic take?
Yeah, I think we have, so much later research, I have to say that I did, dealt with this question of these two tracks of citizenship in Europe. And while nations were pushing migrants to become more national, learn the national language, national culture, national behaviors, they were at the same time pushing natives to become more European. And so no matter what the immigrants were doing, they couldn't catch up. And certainly the idea of of thinking about different ways that you can still feel patriotism and be comfortable in it without going overboard is, it's still a real thing. And people are still talking about it because the lines are so difficult. When the normal discourse has shifted into almost jingoistic, I mean, I can speak certainly from my own country where I'm horrified at what people say on the street. I think a little, Verfassungspatriotismus would be not a bad thing. Yeah.
Maybe a question about this. What I understood is the thesis of ethnic conflicts. So what you showed us about the research on swimming pools. I think I got different research differently. So I think there's also a research about ethnic conflict that tells quite the opposite story. So before you have cities where various ethnicities eat, the less people vote for other similar how does that fit?
So I have to say that when I read the report, I was so freaked out by it because I said, how is this possible? This flies in the face of everything we've been teaching. So I did look for other articles. And I will be, as I noted, I would like to see more research that looks specifically at swimming pools because I couldn't find others. Now, they said they mapped all of Germany, geolocated, they ran all the data, then they ran the data specifically in Hamburg and in Berlin, and they said every time it shows up. And so that's why I thought maybe we're just a little too close. I don't know. Maybe swimming pools are different than a park. I don't know.
And there's also been a discourse about, I think it's part of the statistically each case for itself and turning into a regression is the fact that the result of the people actually working on the web and there were incidents largely reflected and debated and discussed mobilized as to make sure that there will be maybe a similar reaction accessibility. So maybe this is, if we would see this kind of research done over, let's say, 10 years, then I think I would buy it more. Otherwise, it's more about the discourse that surrounds us.
So, I mean, is it the pool or is it something else? And I can, there's been a big conflict in New York City about swimming pools because they did set women and pools in areas with large numbers of Orthodox Jews and Muslims have set aside hours in the swimming pool where there are no men. And there were protests for and against, and people sued the city to say that it is against this very same Civil Rights Act that says you can't deny access. And it brought together a lot of strange political bedfellows to say, well, we need to have the alone time in the pool. And so the city in the end, really fearing a nightmare, curtailed the hours to 2 hours a week, if I'm not mistaken. So, that's instead of, keeping the 8 hours. In order to bring women together, they had to exclude men. So I come back to the same kind of, very negative feelings as well. And it continues to be an issue in the public schools where there are some schools that do have swimming pools. Yeah.
I was inspired by many things you said, but especially the lack of loneliness you showed us. It's very interesting. I was thinking like what are the regional patterns, whatever, and also which are the tasks governments, academics and sorry to bring this here, but I would be very interested in your opinion in a research, expert research with a colleague of mine. We found, and we still try to interpret this, that the less happy people are, less happy individuals, are more likely to interact in terms of politics, so to talk about politics. That this is a finding of us, and we, like the publishing process is on. I wanted to, like, what do you think of that? Not only are unhappy people are more likely to talk about politics with each other. You know, some interpretations are like, well, they go to the pub and drink there and talk about politics, or they consider like Facebook comments as political interactions and answer certain questions accordingly. I don't know if I don't know. I wouldn't say that the lonelier country are more politically active on your map.
I think it's really fascinating. I have to say, I grew up in a family where politics was every single mealtime discussion. And I don't think we're unhappy, but we may be an N of one, I don't know. But I think it's an interest, I mean, politics is used as a proxy talk, the same way people use sports or literature when they're not really talking about, you don't think so?
Whether
People, I think people use politics as a proxy talk.
yeah, but I mean, it's like new things to talk about in the debate. Could we actually be unhappy with politics makes people talk? But
Yeah.
Also true. Also true.
yes.
You're not doing this, you need to go and see your own strategy, which are public finance, channel, or public is even the language, or it's good at these. So maybe just unhappy with your way of what.
Yeah, but the concept of belonging just it's like something I would take with me.
Thank you very much.
Lydia?
Once again, come to this really useful. Just reflect on this in Finland, of course, we have this really cool and we have like discussion about we have despite the libraries, but libraries are better because we don't need it. But
That's what I'm saying.
getting a chance to read in the sauna, in the city. And this is the place where, according to research, a lot of discussions take place. And actually, some of my colleagues are discussing in public sauna on a regular basis with the far right, people. So they have like this kind of like local parliament, just of course making a decision, discussion forum. They sit in sauna on a weekly basis, and then these researchers from the far right, for instance, they hang out there, discuss with people. Some of them are, yeah. So that's like kind of integrated, but of course it's generous. So it's only for the men. These discussions, all that they are. So that it's like I was saying earlier, when you start employment or some of this.
Excluding, exactly.
And then I wanted to make a point about this great idea about this thing that we should be collaborating and that we should be okay with that. This time, do you think that EU should have funding for like, previously the projects that they have been funding. But now we were told, for instance, and pledge people that we should be, getting in touch with people. So, if you are with the project, so we might have to be. I'm sorry.
Maybe with the Asian people or the sports people, not with the.
Steve, we are not because. So, just, sorry. At the beginning, when you talked about belonging, the study of detection and all this reminds me very much of how it was sort of the strength of
Absolutely.
This is what really finds people to the neighborhood. It's not the friends and family living close by, it's the shop assistant, it's the woman you see every day walking alone. So this is what really also gives us very strong sense of belonging. Well, the citizenship question, I was wondering when I read the citizenship is we have been invited to a discussion about urgency.
I'm sorry, what kind of?
So being a citizen of the city you live in.
Oh, okay.
So this will be not the level up, but the level down.
Yeah.
Of course, the room for cities is very big when it comes to even cities. But urban cities is more a concept.
Absolutely. And we see, I mean, there are cities in the United States that offer ID cards for that city. And you can use them to open a bank account or to get discounts on everything imaginable. You can use them as official ID, even though they're really not, in order to rent an apartment or things like that. What's kind of interesting about it, at least in the New York City case, is that they kept all these, I always thought that it was really a mechanism of surveillance, okay? Here's the, politics cynical part of me, because this was a way to map people who were unfindable, the homeless, the, undocumented, et cetera. So when the city was sued to get the data, then the officials that had it decided they weren't going to keep any, and that you would just get a card that was tied to nothing, theoretically. We never really got the full idea if it's still there. But I think it's a really important idea, which is why when I talk about citizenship, I don't just mean national, you get a passport citizenship. It's, you're part of a community, and a real community, as you and I, like a touchy-feely, hug people kind of community.
I was wondering actually, how sauna, does it even serve as a method of integrating migrants?
Oh, that's interesting.
And then especially the comes from it's like alcohol, it's like there are a lot of these kind of things that are embedded, but then in the library, we're very concerned about the presentation about you don't have also free space in that sense, but the one of it is putting the sour. Things are changing now. Maybe you know mostly that. Really but so they are like
If I could just say something before we end, I just wanted to say thank you for making me feel like I belong. It's really been such a pleasure.